Welcome to all of you, and welcome to everybody that's on the Zoom session as well. If you can't hear us or have any issues, be sure to let us know. So we are not going to switch back and forth every slide. We're going to do it in chunks. So you'll have me for a little bit, and then Lori for the major center part, and then me again at the end. So hopefully that'll keep you from getting whiplash from us going back and forth. So today we're going to cover, as she said, preparing a budget in KC. We do have the PowerPoint link on your screen, so if you have not already downloaded the PowerPoint, you'll want to do that, primarily because there's a lot of really great resources and links to great resources on there. So it'll be a good reason to have that saved to your computer so that you can access those quickly. We're going to talk about why budgets matter. It's really one of the things that we spend the most time on is reviewing and talking about budgets. And so we want to talk a little bit about why it's so important. We'll be giving you a lot of budgeting tips, and then again, making sure that you're aware of some resources and tools that are needed to prepare your budget. And obviously the whole reason for doing a good budget is so that you get your funding. So our objectives are to develop an understanding of the role of the budget, to understand the principles that guide the development of acceptable budgets. You can't just create any old budget and submit it to your funder, and to obtain some tools to help you develop accurate budgets. Kind of our overarching principle, especially with federal grants, is what we call the uniform guidance, or 2 CFR Part 215. And it was funny, right before lunch we were talking about when exactly did this go into effect? And we really started talking about it a lot about 3 years ago, and we think it went into effect right around January of 2016. And so if you've been around for a while and seeking funding, you've probably heard people talking about some of the changes in uniform guidance. One of the big ones that comes up all the time is you can't use the word honoraria. So you may have run up against that. But really the big overarching principles are that your costs in any federal grant must be allowable, they must be reasonable, and they must be allocable. And we've given you a link there that well, you need to look up anything. I'm getting feedback. There we go. So that you can go out and look up some of the things if you ever have a question about if something can be included. So a lot of the really common things, there are very specific rules. So I mentioned honoraria, things like food at conferences, a whole variety of things. You'll want to check that out. And whoever is reviewing your budget will also help you with that. Okay, I'm going to hand it over to Lori. I'm going to do the demoing, and we're going to go from there.
Thanks, Marcy. So I am in the College of Ag and Natural Resources as a pre-award support person. So it's important to notify your contact as soon as you decide that you're going to submit a proposal. Obviously, the earlier the better. Make sure you send your solicitation or any other information to your contact, and then also make sure that you read through it yourself. Also, let your contact know the project dates and title, the names of all project personnel, and then their role on the project. Is the proposal going to be collaborative? And if so, then who's going to be the lead? Are there subawards? If there are, who are those institutions or organizations? And then also, have you communicated any budget limits with them? And obviously, I know early on in the project, you may not know all of these details yet, but as soon as you do determine those, it's really important to convey that to your contact, because we need this information to go ahead and set up a proposal development document in the system. And we're going to show you that later on in the presentation. So it's really important to set some deadlines for the various proposal documents that you're going to need. So setting deadlines for the personnel documents, those are your biosketches, current and pending letters of support. We need to check those for margins and for font, if page numbers are required or headers. And so the more time that we have to do that, the better. And then also deadlines for your subawards. Remember that it takes them time to get their documents ready and then approved by their institution. So just like MSU has the internal deadlines, they also have those. So we have to back up even further. So communication is really key, and having this extra time allows for any corrections or changes that you might need to make real close to the submission date. So here is a link to some KC resources for developing your budget. If you do not have a pre-award support person, these materials will help you learn how to use KC to find the salary and fringe. And then today, we're actually going to show you step by step how to build a proposal development document and then a budget and get those salary and fringes for yourself.
So if you go to the OSP website, you can just click on support materials up here on the left. And there are a bunch.
Okay, so we're going to talk about some budgeting tips. So look for specific requirements in your solicitation. This may be project date restrictions, or it may be your project date must start 6 months in advance, or a certain date like in April of the next year. Budget caps. This could be by each year of the budget, or it could be the total project budget. Look for any limits to F&A. Also required travel for PI meetings, any required cost share or match, and then justification details. So the sponsor may want you to list your justification year by year, or they may want you just to do it in the overall budget categories. And then sub-award budgets. There could be specific budget forms that they have to use, or letters of support, or an AOR letter, which is an authorized organizational representative letter. So why is the budget relevant? Well, the budget helps guide your scope of work for the entire project. If your budget's too low for the amount of work that you're proposing, then your proposal may be too ambitious for the funding that's available. Or if your budget's too high, then the funding request may be perceived as unreasonable. So there are typical budget categories. So the 3 main budget categories are personnel, non-personnel, and then your indirect costs or F&A. Underneath non-personnel, we have some sub-budget categories. So that's equipment, travel, and other direct costs. Under other direct costs, we've got specific budget categories for the supplies, publications, consultants, etc. All right, so now we're going to talk about creating a proposal development document. We typically refer to this as PD. And so we're going to go ahead and I'm going to talk through what we're going to do, and then Marcy will go ahead and actually demonstrate it in the system. So first you're going to want to log into EBS, and then you should be on the Researcher tab. And then, can you just wait till I finish?
Sorry, oops, sorry.
Okay. Then you're going to click on Create Proposal. And there are 7 fields that you need to complete. Once you have those 7 fields completed, you're going to click Save, and then you're going to generate a proposal development document. And there will be a specific PD number associated with it. Now this is going to go ahead, this will be in your action list. And so then you can use this as your test or inquiry proposal to play around in there and then get your salary and fringe information.
Wrong one. Sorry, okay. Here's your Researcher tab, or Research Administration tab.
So at this point, you would have logged into EBS and done that 2-factor.
Okay. And typically you'll go from the Researcher tab here, create proposal. And these are small on the screen. And these are your 7 fields that you have to fill in. So in most cases, your proposal type is going to be new. So unless you're doing like a pre-proposal or an award revision, but typically you're going to be doing new. Your lead unit, and you will know your number for your lead unit. You can do a search to pull up the one that you want. I'm just going to pull up university for our cases or our purposes today. You'll put in your activity type. In most cases, this is going to be research, but we do see quite often education and instruction or public service. Your title, if you don't know the title yet, and this is very common, you can put even just to be determined. Just make sure that you change it before you route your PD. Your deadline date, you can either put in a deadline date if you have one, or if it's a kind of an open-ended, you can pick no deadline date. So we'll just say November 15th. Your sponsor code, you can do a search, or if you know your sponsor code, we'll do state of Michigan. And then your project start date and your end date. So once you get those in, you'll hit save. And now when you look here under proposal number, that's going to be your PD number. So when you communicate with OSP or anybody else, that's what they're really looking for. You can give them the doc number, but then it's a couple extra steps. And so we really appreciate if you just give us that PD number. It makes it much more useful.
One thing I want to mention while we're still on this page, I mentioned how this could be your test proposal that you can play around in. When you are going in, don't forget these start and end dates. So if you're working on one proposal and you want to know what the budget is going to be, you've got those dates in there. Well, when you go back in to check on another proposal that you're going to be doing, don't forget to update these dates in the system, because that's going to affect your budget. And when we get into that, it'll make more sense. So. Yep, I can do that. And that way we don't have to switch back and forth. So, okay. We keep getting kicked out, so we're just going to keep it on here. Although I don't know for the people that are Zooming, I don't know if they all have the slides. All right, so next we're going to create a budget in KC. So we're going to click on the Budget Versions tab. We're going to enter a name for our budget. This name can be 40 characters or less. And then you're going to go ahead and click Add. And then you're going to go ahead and click Open, and this will advance you into the budget module. All right, so now we're going to go ahead and add some personnel. You want to click on the Personnel tab. Then you're going to click on Employee Search. Here you can type in the name of the person that you're looking for.
Are we using the one live index or? Sure. Mm-hmm. All right. How do you spell his name?
L-U-Y-E-N.
That's what I did.
So then you'll see that there is a checkbox next to the person. You're going to click that, and then you're going to hit the Return Selected button. This is going to take us back to the Personnel tab. Then when you're on the Personnel tab, you're going to click Save at the bottom of the screen. And then we're going to go down to the Personnel Detail tab. You can see Marcy clicked on Show to open that up. And then you'll see here where there is the Person drop down. So you choose the person that you'd like, and then you have to select the object code. So there are a number of choices here. So you can choose faculty salary, or you can see their summer salary for faculty. So we'll choose one of those. And then
to match. So if this is 9 months, you want it to be.
Correct. Yeah. If we had chosen the summer for this person, then we would go ahead and choose faculty summer for the object code. And then we're going to go ahead and click Add. And then now this person is in the budget. And you'll see that Casey automatically went ahead and only included this person for the 9 months and excluded the summer dates. We have two fields, the percent effort and the percent charged. So we're going to go ahead and enter the appropriate amount of effort that this person is going to work on the project. We're going to hit calculate. Oh, sorry, she's still filling it in. Got to make sure we get them all. I'm going to get to that in just a moment. So the question was, do those have to match? So I'll address that in 1 minute. Okay, so here you've got your salary and fringe for Dr. Lyondike. So the question about do those have to match? If you had cost share, that was a requirement in your budget, you could actually enter in the effort. Let's say you were going to work 20%, but you were only going to charge 15% to the budget, then KC will automatically calculate that cost share for you. If you do not have required cost share, then make sure that those two numbers are the same.
So this is what it looks like when it doesn't match. The requested salary is the 15% that we're charging to the grant. But if you look down here, then it's going to show you the amount of the cost share as well.
Yes.
So when you say percent effort and it's for summer salary, is it for each month of the summer 20% or 20% across the 3 months?
Across the 3 months.
Yeah, across the 3 months. Yes.
If you want to work like a week each month, then you have to get 3 months, like 3 weeks.
3 weeks, right. So if you were going to do 1 month of summer salary, that's equal to 33.34 that you would put in the effort and in the charged. Yes. And then this cost share that shows up here down below, when the budget actually gets submitted to the sponsor, that will show in the budget. There will be a cost share column. Okay. All right, so now we're going to go ahead and add some to be named personnel into our budget. So you'll see we're still on the personnel tab. We're going to click on to be named. And then this brings us into here, and then instead of entering anything, just click the search button, and then a drop down will appear, and then there are a number of to be named personnel that you can choose from. Now this works the same way as named personnel, where you've got a checkbox, and so you can choose the people that you would like in your budget. So undergrad, grad student, research associate is the same as postdoc, and then there are technicians. Yep, so there are quite a few that you can choose.
Let's do grad students, since that's a big one.
Yeah. So then you would go ahead and follow the same steps where you hit the button to return them, and then we're going to go ahead and add them into the budget.
We're going to add a salary.
Yes. So I don't know if you noticed when you pull the grad student in, anybody that's to be named does not have a salary. So you have to enter that information for them. And then, yep, you're gonna click save. And then the same thing, we're gonna go to that drop down where you can select the person. So we're gonna choose our grad student. And then we're gonna select the appropriate object code for the grad student, which is listed right there. And then we're gonna click add. I do wanna say at this point, if you had 2 grad students or possibly 2 undergrads that you wanted in your budget, you're gonna need to, you can only add them 1 at a time. So if you had 2, then you've gotta go back out, check the undergrad box again, return selected, and then bring that person into the budget. And then we have the same fields, the effort and charge that you're gonna wanna enter in. And then you're gonna click calculate. And then now our salary and fringe will be generated. The other thing I want to point out is the salary that you input. Like if you had an undergrad that you wanted to be at $5,000 in the first year of the budget, with KC, our project date isn't that far in the future, but most of the time your first year project date is going to be 6 to 9 months in the future. So KC automatically calculates that 3% increase. So if you want your undergrad to be at 5,000 in year 1, you're probably going to have to enter about 4,800 for their base salary. So you may have to play with that a little bit if you've got a specific number that you want to get to in the first year of your budget.
They could also turn off apply inflation.
Yes.
Okay.
But if you advance that, then it won't be applying inflation for the
Yeah,
rest
you'd
of
have
the years.
You'd have to
Yeah.
manually. So. Okay.
All right. So the next slide has some budget resources. Would you like to show that? Yes, thank you. So here is some information and salary links for technical staff. And then we also have some links for postdocs and grad students. One thing on the budget, when we added our grad student, we had their salary and then we had their health or their fringe costs. KC automatically calculates that for you, but the grad student tuition and fees, you have to manually enter those into the other direct cost budget category. And we'll talk about that later on in the presentation, but I wanted to point that out that you're gonna have to enter that manually. All right, are there any questions about the personnel section? All right, none, okay, all righty.
Sure.
So now we're gonna talk about the non-personnel budget categories. So we have equipment. Equipment is described as an item that's costing $5,000 or more and has a useful life of more than 1 year. Now, F&A or indirect costs are not charged on equipment under modified total direct costs. And Marcy's gonna touch on F&A and MTDC and TDC later on in the presentation. Any items that cost less than $5,000 are not considered equipment, and then you need to put those in the materials and supplies category. Would you like to show that? Okay. So now we're going to show you, you would click on non-personnel, and then you'll see here there are some budget categories. We've opened equipment, and then you can select. You can enter a description of what this equipment is. It can be a centrifuge or -80 freezer, something like that. And then enter your cost.
And don't forget to hit add.
Yes. And once you add that, you'll see how that dropped down into the budget. All right, so now we're gonna look at domestic travel. So as I mentioned before, you're gonna wanna make sure that you look for any required travel in the solicitation or RFA. We're seeing a lot where the PI has to attend a meeting every year of the project. And then you need to be as detailed as possible in your budget justification. This is the one area where you really need to provide as much detail as you can. OSP, as well as the sponsor, is looking for this information and giving estimates on airfare, per diem, lodging, all of those things associated with travel. And then also scientific meetings. If you know what those meetings are that you're going to attend and then the number of people, it's good to list that there as well. So Marcy's going to take us to the MSU Travel website. And on this website, there's a lot of information that you can get for per diem and lodging. A lot of links here for that.
Did you?
I was thinking maybe the CONUS link. So Marcy clicked on the CONUS link, and you can see here you can search by state or zip code. And then click on the find rates. And then you'll see here where it lists the month, depending on where you're at. District of Columbia here, then it's showing you the different meals and incidentals rate as well as the average lodging cost. So this is a good place to get an estimate of what that will cost.
Anything else you want to see in there?
I think that's it. So now, international travel. So you need to budget international travel with US rates. There may be some unique costs in your budget as well. Vaccines or immunization, visa costs, even in-country consultants that you might need to add into your budget. And then like I mentioned with domestic travel, it's the same. Make sure you put as much detail as possible in there. And then here we have two links that will help you prepare your international budget and also give you additional information and tools for international projects. These links really contain a lot of really good information if you're going to be doing international proposals. So that brings us to the other direct costs budget category. So materials and supplies. So this is where you would list your project-specific supplies, lab supplies, diagnostic kits or tests. And then supplies that are typically not allowed in a budget are computers, office supply, and food. Now, if you are going to have these in your budget, you need to make sure in the sponsor or the solicitation. And then also, if you do add these, you're going to need to have additional detail in your justification. So they want you to say why that it's important for the project and what value it's going to add. Yes, Shobha.
One of the things, could you also mention some of the proposals have, you know, they're going to host seminars or conferences related to the project, then food is allowable in some cases, right? So could you please touch on that?
Speak to that?
Yeah, you might need to kind of recap what she asked.
Sure. Soba is at, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just mentioning because sometimes the proposals we do have, you know, you're hosting seminars or you're hosting a conference as part of the project itself, then food is allowable in those instances, but you need to give details of that. So I was just asking Marcy and Lori to talk a little bit about, because when you say ban on food, you know, there's sometimes they are allowed. So
Yes, that's true.
Correct. And part of that does depend on the funder. So there are funders in some solicitations that will specifically say no food or that food is allowed. We'll see solicitations that are specifically for workshop grants or conference grants, and those will typically allow food. So you really want to look at that. A lot of times they will say that it's not allowable for MSU staff or for the grant staff unless they're on travel status. So you want to look at that as well. I think the biggest issue is to make sure that we have to go back to those 3 words, the reasonable, allowable, and allocable, and make sure that, you know, you're not charging $100 for a lunch per person. So that's a big thing to look at. So there's probably too much, you know, to go into, but that's another place where it's just very important to provide the details. And so that when you get your budget reviewed by OSP, we can make that determination on whether or not this suits your funder and whether it can be included. So hopefully that answered your question.
Mhm.
Was there another question?
I had a question about equipment.
Mm-hmm.
So I was under the impression, and maybe this is just for certain types of grants, that equipment has to be something that as soon as the grant is over will vanish and could never be used again for anything else. Is that true?
That's kind of the general, I guess, understanding. I'm not sure that's the right word, but it is intended that the equipment to be used for that research. And so in a lot of cases, it may be equipment that its useful life is going to be pretty much over with by the end of the grant period. We've had some situations very recently, we've had a funder coming back and asking when certain equipment will be returned to them because they paid for it and they feel it should go back to them. It's really a case of making sure you keep your inventory, and if that's requested, then it may be a situation where you have to do that. I've also had the opposite situation where I typed in green tractor, if you could see that. We actually had a grant come through where they requested purchase of a tractor. And I thought, well, I don't even know if that's reasonable. So luckily my manager is very familiar with those types of things. And so she was able to look at it and say, okay, this is clearly a used tractor. It is going to be pretty much done by the end of 4 years. And so some of it's just kind of a judgment call, but typically equipment cost, if a funder decides, no, that's not a reasonable cost, that's what they'll cut from your budget. Sure.
So now we're going to show you in KC where you can add materials and supplies to your budget.
Okay, so they're going to be under Other Direct. There's a whole lot of things.
Yes. So you can choose material and supplies.
Speakers. Now, the thing to remember here is you're going to put a quantity in, but remember you're putting in your total cost. A lot of times we see people that say, okay, I'm going to buy 100 beakers at $10 each. So they put in 100 and then $10 for the base cost. You're putting in your total there. It's a really common mistake. And remember that materials and supplies are generally tangible. That's probably one of the biggest mistakes I run across is people try to put something in there that's a non-tangible.
And then we kind of skipped through the travel, but there is a travel drop down where you can enter your domestic and your international travel. It functions basically the same. You can see you enter the information, click add, and then it will drop into your budget. Okay. So professional services and consultants. So typically MSU employees are not allowed to be consultants on the MSU budget. With consultants, you need to specify an hourly rate of pay and the number of days that the consultant is expected to work on the project. You can include travel, lodging, and meals on the consultant line item. And then consultants are usually paid individually and not through their institutional salary. Do I add a consultant? Sure.
Okay, consultants also go under the other direct costs.
Down under professional services consultant. I'm always looking for C, it's under P for professional services. Like that.
And you can go back. I've made a mistake, so I can go back and fix. Oops. You can fix any math errors or anything like that.
Correct.
Click save.
You'll also notice that there's a delete button. So if you decided later on that you were not going to get the green tractor, then you can just delete that out of your budget. Okay.
Yeah, I can. I want to watch it.
All right, so then we're on publications, documentation, and dissemination. So this is where you would enter your publishing costs for journals. You can also include the preparation and publishing of reports, the cost for storage and index of data and databases, and also the storage and preservation for any lab specimens. And then also, as I mentioned earlier, this is where you're going to enter your graduate tuition and fees. And the link on slide 16 will help you determine the amount that you need to enter there. We're still under the other direct costs. So there's your tuition and fees.
I don't think that's me. Oops. And it's really important that you put the graduate student tuition and fees under the correct object code, because the system knows not to charge F&A on those. So that's why these object codes are very important. It's also really important if you're submitting something to like NIH. So this will be going through our system to system, because then that means it will populate the forms correctly. So make sure that you use the correct dropdowns.
Go ahead and we'll add some publications to this. All right.
Save.
Yep. All right, subawards. So obviously subawards include and fund collaborators from other institutions. The subaward budget will have their direct costs and their F&A included in their budget. And then budget requirements from the sponsor apply to MSU as well as to the subawards. So any rules and regulations that MSU has to follow, the subaward has to follow those as well. And then any required documentation for the subawards, obviously we're gonna need the budget and the justification, a subrecipient commitment form, a letter signed by their AOR. There will be their personnel documents as well, the bio sketches, current and pending.
Scope of work.
And scope of work, statement of work. That is also, it may not be required for the sponsor, but MSU requires that. So we have an idea of what the subaward is going to be doing on the project. Would you like to enter subaward?
Yep.
Okay.
Okay.
So the subaward, there's drop downs. Yep. So you'll see that Marcy has chosen subawards less than or equal to 25,000. That is because subawards are only charged F&A on the first $25,000. So if you have a subaward that's $100,000, MSU is only going to charge F&A on the first $25,000 of that. The other $75,000 will be exempt from F&A charges.
So if you have a sub that's over 25,000, So say they have $50,000 in direct costs, then we would enter another line for the second 25.
Or if it was $100,000, like our example, then you'd be putting 75,000 there.
And then if whatever their F&A is, so, and we've already used up our under 25,000, so we're going to do subaward F&A over 25. So let's say their F&A is 20,000 on this. Should we show also how to enter it if it's a S2S?
Okay. Budget form, so. Okay, are there any questions on the non-personnel budget categories? Yes.
Put something like genomic sequencing either at our facility or off campus or uses of microscopy core, something like that.
That, sorry, I didn't get to her with that.
Yes. So the question was, where would you put the charges for one of the core centers like microscopy center or something like that? So we have, I just wanted to make sure, typically that would be put under materials and supplies. There, you can use it as a line item by itself, or you can lump it in with everything. There are some other, as you can see, specifics, like for patient care costs and things like that, but all of the, that kind of falls under that large umbrella of materials and supplies.
And there are some of the core services that do not get F&A charged on them. And so those typically will go under equipment or facility rental. And so we usually just have to play around with those a little bit to make sure that whether they're getting the correct F&A or not. So.
Okay, I have a question coming in online from the folks on Zoom. So they're asking for grants that don't allow MSU's full F&A rate. Will KC calculate F&A off total direct instead of MTDC?
Yes.
Yes.
Your question?
You had like 3 subawards?
Yes.
Each one is charged F&A on the first 25,000?
That is correct. So the question was, if you have 3 subawards, is F&A going to be charged on the first $25,000 of each of those subawards? And the answer is yes. All right. Okay, so Marcy's going to talk about F&A costs.
Okay, so the difference when we start talking about direct versus F&A or indirect, there's a lot of different terms that people use to talk about F&A. So F&A, if you're not aware, is facilities and administration. It's also referred to as indirect costs. It's also referred to as overhead. And so depending on kind of what area of nonprofits or education you came from, you may be very familiar with a different term. And we use those pretty much interchangeably. So the direct costs are the things that we just talked about. Those things that are specifically identifiable to your project. And so it's the salaries or that percentage of effort that you entered in there. It's those fringe benefits that are also calculated at the same percentage of effort. Any tuition remission you put in for graduate students, which we just did. Your consultants who are working directly on your project. Your equipment, your supplies, your materials, your travel, and your subawards. So those are all considered your direct costs. Your F&A costs are those things that cannot really specifically be identifiable to your project. And so these are things like the lights, the buildings that you work in, the janitorial service, all those types of things. Utilities, administrative support. Very rarely can you charge administrative support to a grant. And that's a really important thing. Every once in a while, we will see one that comes in that is reasonable, allocable, and allowable. And that's typically because if they're funded, the grant will require a huge amount of effort by an administrative support person. So it may be a project that is really, really heavy in travel. And so that person is going to be spending a lot of time setting up travel, maybe setting up conferences or events. And a lot of times you'll see RFPs that, you know, specifically say that a certain amount is allowable, but very, very rarely. So I would say in the 3 years that I've been here, I could count on one hand probably the number of proposals that we've processed where administrative support is actually allowable. Now, if you're hiring somebody to just be the project coordinator, that's okay. That's a different thing. But to have somebody that you already have in place, maybe as an administrative assistant or even your research administrator, that typically is not an allowable cost. And we can't say enough, check your solicitation for the amount that can be charged to your project. So this is one of the first things that we do in OSP, and I think a lot of departmental research administrators do as well. Look through your RFP to see what they will allow. Most of the big funders, so NIH, NSF, they allow our standard approved rate. But a lot of the agencies, a lot of the foundations, they will either allow a much smaller rate or none at all. So you want to make sure that you look at that, because you don't want to put together a budget and then realize, oh, I'm at the ceiling and I still have to charge 55% in F&A. That kind of throws your budget off just a little bit. So our federally negotiated rate uses the MTDC base, which we've talked about, and that excludes graduate tuition and fees, equipment, participant support costs, subcontract payments over $25,000, and some other costs. So equipment rental, facility rental, those types of things. The equipment one is a big one, and that's why we really need good budget justification from you on your equipment, because a lot of times people will try to kind of cut their budgets a little bit by not having F&A charged on equipment. And so we check that really carefully to make sure, okay, are you buying one big computer that's over $5,000? Or are you buying 5 small desktops? There's a big difference there. Those are not considered equipment. If your project is more than 50% off campus, then you should use the 26% off campus rate. And that's because we're not paying for as much if you're off campus. And so there's a place in your budget to mark that it's an off campus rate. You will notice you don't have to break it down into part of it is off campus and part of it is on campus. We use the all on, all off model. So if it's more than 50%, we consider it all off, and you'll use 26%. Questions on that?
And just to point out, the subawards are not included in that determination. It's just the MSU part of the project.
So here's a table that shows our federally negotiated rates. And we are actually coming up on the end of this period for this rate. So it'll be interesting to see next spring if this changes at all. Right now, we're just moving forward and we budget everything at these rates. So research is budgeted at 55% on top of your total, or on top of your MTDC. Other sponsored activities, typically this is either education or public service. Those are budgeted at 36% of total, or of also of MTDC. And then off campus is 26%. Again, and you had asked this question, and it's a very, very good question. If it goes down, so if it's a funder that says, I use State of Michigan as our example in setting up our PD, generally State of Michigan only allows 20%. And so we charge that on everything, total direct costs. Subawards, everything across the board. So it makes it much easier. So, yes.
A little bit more detail about quantifying that 50% off-campus number.
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking specifically
Mhm.
offsite, but then use the lab to process that data.
Mhm.
So how would I?
I'm sorry, did somebody else have a, oh, okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think anytime you're doing, I mean, for a lot of things, we look at the amount of time that you're spending on campus versus off campus. We don't see a lot of off campus work unless it is, we see a lot with like performance type things where they're going and doing conferences at other places. So yeah, it's really a lot the time spent. Yeah, and it does say on here the current rate agreement will continue to be used. So, you know, we're already budgeting out starting next year, and so it's easy to start thinking about, okay, is this going to change? Remember that your budget is an estimate, and so what you put in there we know is not going to be exactly the amount that you spend, and sometimes that's hard for people. I know they say, I don't know how much I'm going to spend on travel. Airline rates could go up. It's an estimate. It's okay. So. For information on when you're completing your agency forms, every once in a while you may be asked for our federal cognizant agency information, and that information is on here. It's DHHS, Matthew Dito, and so you may see places where you have to fill that in. If you're doing things in KC, any of our system to system, it automatically fills that in. But you'll see his name a lot. Cost sharing. This is probably one of the most, or can be, one of the most frustrating areas that people really, really struggle with. Cost sharing, you may also know it as match, is that portion of the project costs that are paid from sources other than the sponsor. So you may be doing a project that's going to cost you $100,000 or $200,000 to do it, but maybe your sponsor is only going to pay half of that. The rest of that is cost share. Please include that only when it's required. We have a lot of little mini quarrels with folks who think if I put in a bunch of cost share, it's going to make my proposal so much more attractive. In general, that's not true, especially for a federal agency. In fact, they can't really use that as reason to make your proposal more attractive. I know back even 10, 20 years ago, that was a big thing, especially with Department of Ed. We were always kind of bump up our cost share to kind of show commitment to the project. We really, really, really encourage you to keep it at exactly what they ask you to contribute. Because remember, anything that you commit to cost sharing, you have to do, you have to keep record of it, and you have to report on it. So don't overmatch. Mandatory versus voluntary. So what I was just talking about was mandatory. So if they say to you, this is a one-to-one match, you know, your federal budget can be 100,000, that means you have to match another 100,000. And that's the most common, I would say. Sometimes you'll see when it's like a 50% match, but generally, those are considered, that's a mandatory cost share. There's also voluntary cost share. That's when, those are the ones that we kind of discourage. But there are cases when it does come into play. So voluntary cost share is not a requirement in solicitation, but it's a quantifiable amount identified in the proposal that we're not asking for it to be paid for. So some examples of this might be, you have a very well-known consultant from another school who's going to come in and do a certain amount of time helping you, design your surveys or something like that. And we see this a lot when people want to kind of include somebody who's very well known or has very specific skills, and they want that person included, but they're not going to pay them any money. So that's one of the times that you'll see that voluntary cost share. And this is voluntary committed cost share, so you're quantifying it. You'll also see voluntary uncommitted cost share where we don't quantify it. So there's a couple of different places. Cost sharing does require approval from your source of funding before we submit. It also requires approvals. So it has to be on your PD, it has to go through the route. And people have to approve that cost sharing. but we do ask for a confirmation letter or some kind of documentation from the source. So some departments require that their chair writes a letter that says, yes, this is okay. And then we do ask that you add the voluntary cost share dollar amount to the custom data tab. And you'll see that in KC, there is a tab for custom data, and you can enter any voluntary cost share information there in a very simple way. The last big piece I want to talk about is the budget justification. And a lot of times people say, oh, that's not required. Solicitation doesn't need it. I don't need to do that. Yes, you do. It's really, really important. So even if it ends up being just an internal budget justification, it really creates a lot of help for you. So I'm going to go through the things that it does, and then we'll talk about why it's so important. So your budget justification highlights, explains, and provides rationale for each budget category entry and how your PI arrived at that cost. So it provides the cost basis. And I feel like we ask this question about 100 times a day. What's the cost basis for this? Because we always get one consultant, $2,000. Okay, is that $2,000 for 1 week of work? Is it $2,000 for 1 day of work? There's no way for us to know if that's reasonable and allowable if you don't tell us what they're going to do. This is really very, very important. It's used to justify the expenses that you include in your detailed budget. So as we look through, a lot of times when people enter things in KC, they just put lab supplies. Okay, tell us what that means. How did you come about that? Animal care, that's a big one. How many animals? What are you paying for in this? We want to know that you're actually sitting down and thinking about these items rather than just saying, okay, they say I can request 200,000, I'm going to back into it and figure out how much I can request. We don't like to see that. We really want to see, that you've thought about this and that you can actually do your project based on what you're requesting. Watch for page limitations for your budget justification. We don't see this a whole lot, but every once in a while they will say that your budget plus the budget justification is limited to a certain number of pages. And so in that case, you may even end up having an internal budget justification for us, and then maybe a more pared down one for your funder. Like I said, we don't see that a ton. So. We do avoid, or we do advise staying away from including your dollar amounts for categories unless the sponsor requires it. And there are some that will. So there are some sponsors that will tell you they want in your justification specifically the amounts. And that's fine, but generally we ask you not to do that. For one thing, if you have to make changes at the last minute, then you also have to go back and make sure it matches. And that can be a pain in the neck. So we advise to leave that out. We also really discourage you from saying, except for on consultants, but for MSU staff or faculty, you never want to say hours. They're working so many hours. It's either person months or percentage. Okay. Be very detailed when you're justifying certain categories, especially, and Lori touched on this, foreign travel and consultants. Those are looked at very closely. Make sure that you cover that. Oh, I got down here too. Watch for agency rules on justifying effort, percentages versus person months. Some agencies do not want to see percentages. They only want to see person months, and others are the exact opposite. So a lot of people include both, but just make sure that you check your RFP. I was a reviewer for many years, and I can tell you that the best thing you can do when you're writing a proposal, budget, or the rest of your proposal, think about your reviewer and how tired they are when they're reading these. They've probably already worked a full day and now they're going home to read grants or grant proposals at midnight. Think about them. Make it really easy to follow your budget justification. Same thing for OSP. Your review of your budget and your approval is going to go so much faster if we know what you're asking about, because it's going to really eliminate all that back and forth. So if you have a budget justification that lines it all out, you're probably going to be golden. And then also in your budget justification, make sure that you're not using more effort for individuals than what you're budgeting for, unless you have that mandatory cost share. Okay, and then you want to line that out very carefully. Okay. So in summary, as Lori told you at the very beginning, make sure that you establish contact between the PI, your pre-award office, and any potential subawards early, especially the subawards, because, you know, we all talk about, we have our processes here and how they can take a while. They have the same things. So we need to remember that we want to get that going very early. Budgets must be allowable, reasonable, and allocable. They can make or break any proposal. Make sure you check your solicitation for specific budgetary requirements. Understand direct versus indirect. Pay attention to cost sharing requirements or restrictions. And then the budget justification can make your budget review much more efficient, and that's at every level. If you're a PI and you're giving it to your research administrator, it's going to help them know what you're doing. And then all the way up the chain. Questions? And if we need to go back in KC, we can also show stuff too.
Okay, thank you very much. I thought there was a slot where you guys put cost for like incidentals. I didn't see that one.
For
Incidental costs, yeah.
Such as?
I mean, just the precautional costs like transport in cases of you have for conferences, you have incidental costs like transport for guests and international scholars are coming in. So you might have that one as well.
So things like that would be budgeted in the appropriate line item. And it's an estimate. And so you would, you know, think about the types of things that could come up and put those, so what in the things that you mentioned, those would go under travel.
Mm-hmm.
That's okay.
Lay it on us again.
Yeah, so like within personnel, I'm guessing maybe you can be like maybe flexible, but what if you're using some of your equipment costs to support personnel? Can you do that? To what extent?
It really depends on the agency, your funder. So some of them have very specific rules about the percentages that you can move around without prior approval. And so in those cases, you're going to work with your program or your grants officer at the agency to determine what you can move around. And then you would work with our post-award to do that. And you may have more experience with that as well.
Yeah, just that's exactly what I was going to say. Same thing. It just depends on the agency and the sponsor.
Can you say something about USDA, for example, or it's even like depends on which category within the USDA you're applying for?
I think USDA is fairly flexible within the personnel category and then like your materials and supplies. But you definitely would want to check with your program officer on that if you had major changes to that. And then also the contracts and grants team here at MSU. And they could advise you and guide you and then work with USDA.
Okay, thank you.
For those grants that don't charge indirect costs, can you go over the process of working with OSP? Do we have to submit the full proposal to you or just the budget? And is that timeline different for than the grants where there is indirect costs that are going to be taken out?
All budgets will go through OSP. So, and as far as whether we get the entire proposal ahead of time, that kind of depends on how it's submitted. So that's more of that type of thing. The thing that we ask for when a budget comes in or we get notified of a proposal is that we have a copy of the solicitation. And that way, when your budget comes in and you haven't charged indirect, we can look at that solicitation and say, oh, okay, this is why they didn't do it. And if we can't find it, then we may come back to you and say, why did you not charge indirect? So, and very often the answer is, well, we never have. And so then we have to do some working to get some updated documentation and make sure that that's the policy of the agency. We also will use that solicitation extensively throughout the budget review. And then if we're reviewing your proposal, that as well.
Other question, and then we've got a few coming in on Zoom as well.
What if the funding comes from a private industry where there's no solicitation? How do you proceed with that? I mean, is the award still goes through OSP?
Yeah, generally. If there's no federal funding, so if they're not flowing through federal money, then it would actually go through Business Connect and not OSP. Now, if it's coming through industry, but they have they're a federal pass-through, and we see that a lot. A lot of businesses will flow through money from like Department of Energy, then it would still go through us. And in those cases, generally, there is some sort of RFP or at least a letter or some kind of guideline that's telling them what they need.
Thank you.
But when you do work, I should add, when you work with Business Connect, they use KC as well.
Yeah.
So it'll go through the same online system.
Okay, I thought we had a question. It's a little bit more of a comment. So the one of the viewers on Zoom is saying if it's a sub-award, be sure you get that budget started and done as soon as possible from all parties involved. So do you have more to add to that comment
Definitely.
or other advice?
That's very accurate. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, the sooner the better. Yes.
Okay, and I don't have any other online questions, but perhaps on the screen, could you go back to where the different training materials are? And we are recording this Zoom session today, so we will post it later on the same event page where you downloaded the slides. And so that way they can see some of your screenshots and where you entered things in, but maybe you can also refer again to any training materials where they can go through this again.
Sure. So if you go to the OSP website, it's a really great kind of landing pad, and it will take you to OVPRGS for some of the resources. I'm going to go there in a second, but I also want to show you another thing on here. We have a great FAQ right on this main page. And a lot of the budget data that you might be looking for is here. If you're looking for a DUNS number, a tax ID number, any of those types of things, if you go to this FAQ, even the address, a lot of these are very, very useful. And at least once a week, I talk to somebody and I guide them to this, and they're like, "Oh, I didn't even know that was there." So it's really handy. So, but going back to this, scroll up. Okay. So this orange box for the KC system for support materials, click here, and this is going to then take you out to a lot of our training materials. There's a lot of really great job aids that are, broken down by kind of chunks of things that you need to learn how to do. There's also some really great videos. And so depending on how you learn, if you're a learner who does better with just reading something and following it along, you can do the job aids. If you're better at watching a video and learning that way, you have that option.
I had a question about the subawards. Is it $25,000 per year or per grant?
Total.
Total.
So you just take it out in the first year, and then after that, it's zero.
Correct.
Okay.
Yep. Or until they meet that 25,000. It might be spread over 2 or 3 years, but yep, as soon as they meet that, then everything after that is excluded from the FNA.
It's a really good question. It comes up a lot.
Marcy and Lori, could you comment on the caps on salaries for NSF and NIH?
Sure.
Because NIH has a salary cap, and I think NSF also allows for 2 months.
Mm-hmm.
So could you please comment on that?
Sure. Do you?
Either way. Either way.
So NIH does have a salary cap, and I cannot spit it out right at the top of my head. It's like 183,277 or something like that right now.
So some of the doctors who might be doing, the salaries are so high that they cap it. So
I think it's 187.5, but
Is that what it- okay.
I think somewhere around there, but yes.
I keep it on my desktop, so I don't have to remember it.
Yeah.
And then it's broken down into academic year and summer as well. So
Yeah. So you can only budget up to that amount. So when you're requesting salary, then we can adjust that in KC. And so then that is the maximum amount of salary that you can budget for that person.
Then for NSF also, they have a 2-month cap.
Yes.
So
yeah, NSF limits 2 months of funding, not just on one NSF award, but on all of them. So if you're gonna apply for another proposal and you already have an NSF one and then you have 1 month, then you can only request 1 month on the new proposal.
And that's why those current and pending forms are very important.
Yes, just again a clarification or some comment on the non-allowable costs. That's the computers, foods, and then stationery or something like that. Is there some other source that is expected? To provide for that, at least to cover for that, because there are some instances whereby you may find yourself really needing to buy maybe some computers and some materials, some stationery here and there. Are there some other sources which are expected to be used other than getting from the budget?
So there's some good language in the uniform guidance about computers. And so generally they're looking for, even like a desktop or a laptop, they're looking for purchases that are really intended to be just for that project. So they're not looking for a PI who is going to buy a desktop for his office just for general use. But if you're collecting data, if you're going to have grad students in who are doing statistical data and they need, a computer just for that purpose, then in that case, then it generally is allowable, depending again on uniform guidance and how it's written. Generally, those items tend to be under $5,000, and so they wouldn't actually be considered equipment. They would go under materials and supplies, and so they would have F&A charged on them. Yes.
Oh, hang on.
So this is a question for clarification regarding the subawards. So with the 25% or whatever the percentage is taken out on that first 25,000, that's an indirect cost for our university. Do we also have to budget whatever their university indirect costs are into the budget? Okay. All right.
That'll already be included when they send you their budget. They'll typically have their F&A cost in their total. So, yeah,
55%.
Yeah, there's 55%. Yeah, and that's just for basically because MSU has to manage that subaward, and so that's why there is some charge on that.
Okay, good discussion. Any other questions in the room or via Zoom?
They're really great questions.
Yeah. Well, great. Well, thanks to both of our presenters. I think that was very informative, and we appreciate all of you coming out today. So thank you so much.